The following talk is offered freely to ensure that no one is ever denied access to these practices and to these teachings. If you feel inspired to make a donation to support this offering, you can go to my website at jonathanfoust.com. While you're there, you can also sign up for a monthly newsletter designed to support you in your practice. Thank you and enjoy.
I've gotten a little paranoid about sleep. I've been reading a lot about sleep and so forth. I've never slept that well, so I'm really on this sleep hygiene kick. And I'm wearing if you haven't, the Aura ring. I don't know if you're aware of this. You have one? I know, yeah. It's a sleep tracker. It's pretty amazing. But now I'm so paranoid around sleep. It's really affecting my sleep. And, there's some basic things about sleep hygiene, and I'd actually like to do a talk on it someday, but one of them is to step away from your screen a few hours before you go to bed, which is excruciating. But I've been doing something really radical as of late, and that is I'm reading these thing called books. And so I picked up a book a while ago, not the kind of book I normally read, but I was just looking for something. And it's the story of Ernest Shackleton with his Antarctic expedition in 1915. And, oh my gosh, what these humans went through, the story is just amazing. They were sailing down to the Antarctic, and it was going to be the first, I think, to go around the Antarctic, but they got caught in sea ice. So it was this packed ice. So there was a 9-month journey, kind of hanging out in the boat, and then the pack ice crushed the boat, and they were camped on a floe next to the boat. And the boat kind of disappeared. So 2 months just living on the ice pack, hoping they'd float toward this little whaling station where they could get help. That didn't happen. So they had these little boats, little lifeboats, and made their way through hurricanes and gales to a tiny little deserted island. And then they took another boat and went through the roughest water in the world, 5 guys in one little boat, to find this one little whaling station. And then they saw the island, but there were hurricane winds with huge waves, so they spent 3 days hanging out there. They finally made it ashore, and then they had a 36-hour walk through unmapped glaciers to get to this whaling station. It's amazing. And it ties right into this talk. So the name of this talk is What It Means to See Clearly. And the subtitle of the talk is When You Meditate, Lock the Emergency Exit Doors. Because the kind of resilience that these guys had to undergo is the same kind of resilience it takes if you have a really sincere desire to be awake in your life. We all have different reasons for being drawn to meditation. For some people, it's just stress reduction. For some people, it's about having a little bit more creativity in your life. Ultimately, I think the practice is about being happy. And it's about being happy independent of what's happening externally. And ultimately, it's about seeing clearly. So I'd like to talk a little bit tonight about waking up inside a story when we begin to realize, wait a minute, what is this life all about anyway? And I'd like to talk about what gets in the way of seeing clearly. If your goal is to really see into the nature of reality, what gets in the way? And there are 3 main forces, and there are 5 other mind states that make it impossible. But I'd also like to talk about, well, what does seeing clearly mean? What is reality, at least according through this lens? I have a good friend who was telling me how he was driving to his new home, which was a McMansion, that he had built, and pulled up in his top-of-the-line BMW. And as he pulled into the driveway of his new home in his top-of-the-line BMW, he mentally said to himself, well, this will finally show that jerk, his father. And then he realized he's been dead for 3 years. And for him, that was an awakening moment when he realized how much of his drive for success was completely informed by wanting to show his father that he was as good, if not better, than him. I think we all have these moments. Sometimes they're really early. Do you ever have that moment when you're a kid with your family and you're thinking to yourself, this can't be my real family. Someday my real family is going to show up. It can't be them. But it's been said that quite often we live in a dream. The analogy that I use all the time because it's so helpful from Joseph Campbell, imagine a big circle, there's a line through it. Above the line is what you're aware of. Below the line is what you're not aware of. It's all the unseen, unfelt forces that drive your life. It's your conditioning. It's all of the motivations that you're not aware of. They're not necessarily bad. They're the ones that can drive you to be a better person, to accomplish things. Quite often, though, they're driven out of fear. The fear of loss, the fear of failure, the fear of shame. Or they're driven by strong desire, the desire to win, the desire to be liked, the desire for success. These unseen, unfelt forces are incredibly powerful. It was Carl Jung who said, there's no greater impact in our world, and particularly in our children, than the unlived lives of the parents. You can sit with that one for a long time. When you think of the wounds of your parents and how they translated into your life, your strategies, your avoidances, and so forth. So something wakes us up in life at some point. When we begin to realize that all we're doing is reacting to life, all we're doing is we're just kind of living in a slumber. Quite often it's pain. Quite often it's the experience of sickness or old age or death that begins to kind of shock us out of this dream state that we live in. And of course, we have moments of waking out of the dream. And for myself in college, a good friend of mine just died in his sleep. And it absolutely shook me to my core. And I found myself reorienting my life, trying to figure what was most important and to really give myself to that. And in 3 or 4 months, that intensity began to fade. And I found myself beginning to kind of fall back into my habitual sense of someone on his way somewhere. I imagine we've all had those experiences. The moments of insight and clarity, and then kind of the fading again. So when you want to wake up, it's very helpful to reflect on your life. It's very helpful to study. It's helpful to really be a scientist and to really be a healthy skeptic, to really determine what is actually true. And meditation can play a big part in that. It can be a very, very helpful tool. And it can help you begin to see into the nature of reality with more clarity. But it's not a walk in the park. You have to be prepared to be stranded on an ice floe from time to time. In an unexamined life, all you do is react. You're just simply reacting to what's happening. Stimulus, response, stimulus, response. It's pure programming. And we see it all the time. I remember Christmas dinner around the table, just sort of predicting who would say what, because it was the same thing they'd said last Christmas. The same stories, with the same inflection every time. There's some comfort in that, but it's not really awake. I was working with someone who, really sincere person, really wanted to be awake. This was on a meditation retreat. And he had worked a lot in his life with kind of an addictive personality. And he had really worked on it. But during a week-long retreat, he was just kind of really watching his thoughts, really just trying to be more aware of the movement of his mind in meditation. And he came in and he talked about his struggles. He said, "Why am I so quick to fantasize and go off into planning and just thinking about good times? I can't be here." He said, "My mind is always wanting things and chasing things. I'm always on to the next thing." He was such a creative, fun, and a really bright guy, but you could see his restlessness. And so he told me about this kind of how he was sort of meditating, and suddenly he was off on this huge fantasy. And I said, "Well, do you have any idea of, before you went off into that fantasy, of what preceded that?" He thought about it for a while, and he said, "Actually, I was thinking about my mother. And I started to feel like a lump in my throat, and then I lost it. And so we just slowed things down a little bit. I said, well, what about that lump in your throat? Can you describe what that felt like? And he sort of felt into it, and he said, this just wants me to get away from it. And we spent a lot of time just sort of coming back and being with it. And I asked the question, I said, does this lump in your throat, does it have an emotion? And then there's a long pause, and he said, this is grief. This is sadness. And then he just took some time to be with it. And as you can imagine, just sort of like a big, big shift, a kind of something becoming more present and a softening and tears. And he said, this is what I do. When I feel anything unpleasant, I jump right into what I'm going to do tomorrow, or I jump right into a fantasy. So you can sense how this works. How part of mindfulness meditation begins to reveal your inborn conditioning. So for him, he was experiencing what is sometimes called one of the three poisons, which is kind of not a great description, but I like to think of them as three fundamental forces. And this is the force of desire and greed. So when things get unpleasant, he immediately would just pop right into right into greed, right into craving, wanting mind. And the thing about wanting mind, it's oftentimes in the kind of the original literature described as a hungry ghost. And the hungry ghosts are these beings that have these big, big bellies and tiny little throats and tiny little mouths. And they're always, always, always hungry. And they can never get enough to satisfy them. And we all know that mind state. The opposite of greed is hatred. When the mind is caught in anger and aversion and ill will. And when you experience anger, hatred, and ill will, quite often there's a very deep unease in there. When someone says they're angry, I always know there's an amazing subset of emotions that actually make up that constellation of anger. Usually there's disappointment, there's sadness, there's grief, there's hopelessness, there's despair. When you can take the time to examine anger and hatred when it arises, quite often has something to do with the fear of losing control. There's the fear of losing something, losing affection, attention, or love, or losing a sense of identity. And we can certainly see that in our culture now. Just the hatred and anger that's out there, this very, very deep fear of loss. The third big energy that shows up is described as delusion or confusion. That we lose our clarity. And quite often we kind of just go into kind of helplessness. We just feel lost. So hatred and greed and delusion are three big, big forces that make it impossible to see clearly. And so when they arise, all of our conditioning is about either nuking them when they're there or just getting away from them. And quite often they're tied into trauma, and you can think of trauma as fear and helplessness. When you feel fear and helplessness, we tend to get flooded. So in this practice of mindfulness, we actually have the opportunity, instead of running from it, to turn toward it. And so we have the opportunity, when it feels safe, to actually have tea with that experience. And just as this man on retreat slowed things down and chose to really look at this craving, fantasizing mind and what the root of that was, what he was really avoiding there. So just beginning to recognize greed, hatred, and confusion when they're there can be helpful, because as soon as you name it, you've severed your identification with it. And then there are 5 mind states that are very helpful to recognize in your meditation practice and in life. Because as soon as you can recognize these, again, when you can name it, you have the opportunity of freeing yourself from it. The first time I taught a formal class was when I was getting my master's. And it was a freshman English class. And I was terrified of ninth graders. I'm still terrified of ninth graders. And my observing teacher, afterward, he was going over how I did. He said, you did okay. But I want you to know that I stopped counting how many times you said the word okay at 30. And I realized I was saying, okay, well, if you could just get out your books, okay? If you could just turn to page 32, okay, and for 45 minutes. Deeply humiliating. Deeply humiliating. And perhaps you know the imposter syndrome. I think we all kind of have it. Just this sense of, if people really knew who I was, they would know how unqualified I am to be here right now. And we get paralyzed by that. So one of these main factors of mind is the factor of doubt. That when you notice that you are doubting, when you're caught in doubt, there's a certain paralysis that occurs. The doubt is doubting yourself, doubting your capabilities. It's doubting the externals, whether you've made the right choices in life. And when you're in doubt, you're really in kind of a stasis. Tied into doubt is sort of the ruthless critic. So these 5 mind states, and I won't take a whole lot of time. There's so much to explore in each of these. And doubt is the kind of this paralysis of mind. These also include aversion, all the different flavors of aversion, of judgment, ill will, blame. And when you're caught in that mind state, again, you cannot see clearly. The opposite of that is craving, fantasy, the pornographic meditations, the planning meditations. The other state is restlessness. It's tied into worry, anxiety. It's when you notice your mind has an inability to land on one thing. It's kind of tied into the hypervigilance of mind. And the opposite of that is sloth and torpor. It's a mind that has kind of a sinking mind, kind of a sleepiness, sort of the cycling, spiraling down in kind of a depressive state. And as I like to say, the good news is there are only 5. The bad news is that they absolutely inform everything we do. But part of the beauty of the practice is that when you engage into self-observation without judgment, you begin to sense how these energies that are all operating below the line, when you lower the line, you begin to see them. And as soon as you can say, this is anger, that is such a huge step. Rather than being angry, you can actually be with your anger. It makes all the difference in the world. One story I know I've shared before, when I went into the Peace Corps, I was really, really wanting to kind of perfect my French, and studied really, really hard, and had all my doubts and so forth, but it was a really, really high priority for me. And I didn't own much, very, very simple life, but the one thing I did own that I really was really attached to was my boombox. And some of you may not know this, there's a thing called cassette tapes that we used to play back then, all these great cassette tapes. And someone stole my boombox. They broke in, they stole my boombox. And then this guy came back to my house with the audacity to sell it back to me. I was so enraged. I totally lit into him in this sort of like a blind fury, just swearing at him in French. And then at some point, I had this thought: you are speaking the best French you've ever spoken in your life. And game over. And I started laughing, because and then of course I put my serious face on and tried to complete the negotiation. But it's like that. These moments when we wake up in a state, there can be clarity, or at least we're not caught in that state. It can be so, so helpful. So doubt kind of plagued me when I was starting to teach, and when I gave my first Dharma talk, I was just absolutely really having a lot of fear going into it. And then after the 10th, not so much. And after the 200th, not so much. And I realized how far I'd kind of come as a teacher. This is a couple of years ago. I was contacted by a pretty prestigious organization here in D.C., and I was asked to give a talk to their executive team and their board and some of their donors about meditation. And the person setting it up called me and said, well, I want to know exactly what you're going to cover because, and there's a long pause, she said, this is a really tough group of people. I said, well, okay, that's totally fine. I'm going to do this and do this and do this. She goes, okay, this is a really tough crowd. I said, okay. So then she called me back like the week before to kind of confirm the time. She said, you feel okay with this? Because it's a really tough crowd. I think it'll be fine. So we met in the organization. She did the introduction, at the podium, and I walked up to the podium, and then she turned to me just before I got to the podium, and then she said, this is a really tough crowd. And it was totally fine. It was totally fine. So I was able to move beyond my doubt. And as much as you may have a predilection to get caught in any one of these 5 mind states, you can move through them. You can absolutely move through them. But it takes this courage to turn toward them rather than to avoid them, to get more familiar with them. And as the Buddha said, it's familiarity that leads to wisdom. One of the best mantras in spiritual practice I've ever run across, it's 2 words: keep going. When you really have an intention to be more awake, to be more alive, to increase your capacity for happiness, it's a guarantee that what you're going to begin to notice is how you're not alive, how you're not happy, and the perseverance that's required. Like Ernest Shackleton and his crew, you just keep on going. And so what happens if you keep going? What happens if you continue to calm the mind and cultivate non-judging awareness? What do you begin to see? And I'm sure that you've seen a lot in your practice. Sometimes we go through periods where the practice feels really stagnant or doesn't feel alive. I love what Pema Chodron says. She said how much she's always been jealous of people who've had these dramatic breakthroughs in their practice. So I've been meditating all these decades. I've never had a breakthrough. I've never had one of those dramatic breakthroughs. But she said, when I look back, I can see how much my life has changed. It's very hard to measure the impact of your practice. I went for a month-long retreat, my second 30-day retreat, all in silence. The first one was so dramatic, so many powerful insights. The second one, I got some stuff out of it, but I came back and got busy again. But it was, I think maybe 3 months later, my wife, Tara, said, you are more relaxed. And I thought about it, and I realized something really deep inside that I couldn't even name. It just sort of softened a little bit. And I actually felt just a little bit fundamentally less anxious. And I can't tell you what I did that did that. But there's a wonderful phrase from Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, who founded Transcendental Meditation and was really into TM for about 15 years. It's such a cliche, but it's so true. He said, you water the root and enjoy the fruit. And that's kind of what happens. It's just like when you have a really, really good sleep. Everything is more informed and more fresh in the morning. In that same way, when you step back from the busyness of your life and you pause, as much as your life is caught in a story, every time you come back to the breath or back to the sound or back to the body, for just a moment you're without a story. And that is so deeply informative. So what can happen in practice? It kind of depends on how you're using your practice. But quite often, if you go deeper and deeper into the concentration practices, the practice of coming back to the here and now and getting more and more precise in kind of drilling into the here and now, there's some very profound states that begin to open up. They're referred to as the jhanas. And the jhanas are states of absorption. And we know these states. We've all experienced them in different ways, but there can be a very kind of systematic development of these states. One of the elements of absorption is pleasant sensations. When you're in the flow state, whether it's playing sports or being in nature or really involved in a task, there's just this quality of real pleasure that occurs. The mind isn't worried about what's next. It's not worried about what happened. You're just sort of in this unfolding moment to moment to moment. We've all had those experiences, intensely pleasurable. Then what can arise in your practice is a sense of joy, piti. And the sense of joy can be, it's like a rush and upwelling in your practice. It's a state of there's no desire. Just, it feels so good just to be here without a restless mind. And as you practice the jhanas, you kind of sense, well, what's underneath this? There's a whole technology to this that's fascinating. And you realize, at least my experience in the jhanas, when I've experienced them pretty much only on month-long retreats, that first rush of joy, it's so pleasurable. I actually was thinking I think I'm done. I think this is it. And then you begin to realize that joy is actually a little bit unstable. And you begin to sense, what's more stable than joy? And kind of under that is a sense of contentment. It's just a little more stable than joy. Under that is a sense of utter peacefulness. And then as your practice continues, and I'll just sort of name these other states, they take you into a sense of the infinity of space. And then into an awareness of the infinity of consciousness. I hope it's good news. And then from the infinity of consciousness to a no-thingness. There's no one thing you can name because you're moving into a non-dual sort of presence. And then the eighth jhana is hard to translate, but it's translated as neither perception nor non-perception. So again, that's beyond the linear rational mind, moving into pure presence. So these are some of the qualities that can occur. And if you ever feel drawn to concentration practices, there are retreats that are dedicated specifically for that. It can be quite a compelling practice. In the practice of mindfulness or non-judging awareness, you begin to notice three fundamental characteristics of reality. I always like to say when the Buddha taught on this, he would always say, don't believe what I'm telling you, but look if you can verify this for yourself. The first quality to look for is called anicca, or impermanence. If you really, really look, almost everything is changing. Anything that is born out of a cause or a condition is going to change. that's such a profound insight, such a profound thing to remember. When you do an intensive retreat, you have an interview with a teacher every couple of days, and because I wanted to look good, I would always try to come up with something, clever but not arrogant, get that perfect thing, And what I noticed, I would try to come up with a really good question, but it would just keep changing. Finally, I went into one for my interview, and I just said to the teacher, I said, everything's changing. What is this? But it is. Everything is changing. That recognition of change, so helpful. The second thing you begin to notice is what's called dukkha. And dukkha is dissatisfaction, unsteadiness, stress. And that is your relationship to what's changing. It's directly connected to what's changing. Anything that's changing, you don't want it to. Anything that isn't changing and you do want it to the degree you're attached, you will suffer. To the degree you're attached, you will feel dissatisfaction and unsteadiness. There's some level of, of course everything's changing. Of course how we're relating to it depends how much we're going to feel stress and suffering. Intellectually, we can get that. But when it's coming from below the line, and you can feel that deep, deep clench of resistance, that's where the practice really comes in. It's when you really find yourself getting caught, when you find yourself really resisting, and all these mind states come flooding in: aversion, fantasy, restlessness, sloth and torpor, doubt, sometimes referred to as the multiple hindrance attack. That's when we really apply the practice. The third characteristic of reality is a really, really interesting one. And the word in Pali is anatta. And it refers to the literal translation as not self. And there are lots of ways to explore this. And we'll touch on this in our kind of closing meditation. But when you really ask yourself, well, where is the self? Where is awareness? Can you locate awareness inside right now? Where is it? Is it here? Or is it in the enteric nervous system, in your guts? Where is the self? And this begins to point toward some very, very powerful insights. So everything is changing. Don't take it personally. And you're not really there anyway. So, chances are, some of the things that you most value in your life came through resilience and through sacrifice. When you really, really wanted something and you went through the burn and you really applied yourself, that sense of accomplishment it's so profound and so juicy. In that same way, when you really want to be more awake, when you really want to increase your capacity for real happiness, it requires a certain amount of resilience, requires a certain amount of focus. And there's an interesting question that some people have. Some people ask, well, does it get easier? As you move along the path, does it get easier? And I think on one level, yes. You believe your thoughts less. You have more access to non-judging awareness. You have more access to a heart that can hold your experience. I think that's true. But what I've noticed, and it's just me, just my opinion, that really what you're doing in this practice is you're unpeeling the onion of who you are. You're just sort of removing the layers of who you are. And as you do that, quite often you begin to sort of unveil the very, very deep early imprints of your conditioning. And quite often it's pre-verbal. So I'm not sure if it gets easier. The technology remains the same. But there are three things that make it a lot easier. And are the classic teachings that have to do with living in the world with this desire to wake up. The first two have to do with practice. And one is to have a personal practice, something you can do on a daily basis that's going to help you to remember. The second is intensive practice. Times when you can step away from all of your habits, all of your routines, all of the regular stimulus, and take a deep dive. And invaluable, really invaluable. And the third is to find people who want what you want. Just as we're doing tonight, gathering together with like-minded people. That third element, as I quite often say, it's maybe the hardest, it's maybe the most important. But when we combine these elements, it makes for a very, very interesting life. A life of becoming more awake and more alive, and really cultivating a heart that can hold this amazing journey that we're on together. Why don't we close with a short yet brief meditation? As you close your eyes, you might take in a nice long deep inhalation and just relax on the out breath. And in your own way, just sensing what has called you to practice. Reflecting on how these forces of greed and hatred and delusion have played in your life, how our culture is so driven by these three winds. The play of these mind states that make it impossible to see clearly. The wanting mind, the aversive mind, the restless mind, the heavy, dense mind, the doubting mind. And these pointing out instructions to remember everything is changing. That how you relate to change determines how free you feel. And just sensing the mystery of who and what you truly are. The mystery of this journey. You might take a moment to honor your path. Imagine your journey filled with a greater sense of ease and well-being. This awakening of clear seeing. And the awakening of the heart. In these final moments, you might wish yourself well and offer your best wishes those around you, radiating out to all beings in all directions. May all be happy. May all feel safe. May all feel free from suffering. And as you're ready, you can gently deepen the breath. And when you're ready, you can open your eyes. Thank you so much for your kind attention. Mindful dialogue is happening. So that's happening over there. Have a wonderful month. I look forward to seeing you in about 5 weeks. Happy trails.